This is Daniel O'Keefe, born in Limerick, Ireland, January 1st, 1874. Little is known about Dan's childhood. He spent most of it in Wales, where his father was a Royal Navy officer. Dan joined the Navy on his 18th birthday. After 3 years of service, in 1896, he was aboard an RR ship which docked in Port Darwin. Finding a land of opportunity, he got his discharge from the Navy and went to work in the tin mines west of Cooktown. With desire to see more of this country, Daniel went south and got work in the Cracow coal mines near Cessnock, New South Wales. When the Boer War broke out in 1899, Dan was quick to enlist, taken on by the British artillery under the rank of gunner. His next of kin was Charlie, my friend from Cooktown. While serving in South Africa, Daniel found himself at the wrong end of a bayonet sword and narrowly survived. As a result, Dan sported a big scar from hip to shoulder. He returned to Australia in 1902, working in various coal mines throughout North Queensland. A year after the First World War broke out, in 1915, Dan enlisted from Cairns. Next of kin, Charlie, my friend from Cooktown. Taken on by the 2nd Australian Tunnelling Company, he left Melbourne on May the 11th the following year, aboard the HMAT Shropshire, which arrived in Plymouth, England 68 days later. The tunnelling companies were established as a result of the British government sending appeals to South Africa, New Zealand, Australia and Canada to establish mining companies for their war effort. This became the Australian Mining Corps, whose men were eventually split into the 1st, 2nd and 3rd Australian tunnelling companies. These companies were made up of civilian miners, mechanics, engineers and electricians with no prior combat experience. Despite being referred to as clay kickers by their British superiors, it was their job to protect and extend on the mines which had been sunk by the 1st and 3rd Canadian tunnelling companies. These Allied mines were sunk deep below enemy territory and were often used to gather intelligence, sometimes the tunnels infringing so close on German lines that soldiers would break through, leading to intense hand-to-hand combat. Held deep within the Allied mines were millions of pounds of explosives. These were to be kept top secret, with the ultimate objective of detonating them from underneath the Germans and putting an end to the war. Flooding and collapses were regular problems in the mines, as was oxygen levels and diseases like gangrene. This was the duty that Dan signed up for. He was initially deployed in France before being sent to the Battle of Somme. Dan's health was always an issue. Even before deployment, he was noted as being prone to bronchitis in the medical examinations. Still, Daniel served in the Allied mines under the rank of sapper for the next 18 months. Whilst fighting in the trenches, Dan endured the ill effects of inhaling mustard gas and was sent to the Reading War Hospital in England for treatment in January of 1918. There, Daniel was deemed unfit to serve. For the next 6 months, Daniel went from hospital to hospital throughout England, insisting he'd find a doctor who'd clear him for service. One doctor declaring that he had gone loopy from the effects of the mustard gas. Finally, Dan was sent to the Herdcott camp before being put on the HMAT Medic A7 ship on August 24th, 1918. He arrived back in Melbourne a little over a fortnight later. Whilst there in Melbourne, Dan married Elizabeth Maybury, and together they went on to have a daughter and 2 sons. Soon after, the newlywed couple moved north near Yeppoon, where they started a farm, but after 5 years, the O'Keefe family moved to Burrellaba, where Dan worked in the coal mines once again. He stayed working in the mines for another 5 years until the flood of 1928, which completely destroyed the mine. Dan was out of a job, and with the dread of the Great Depression increasing, it would prove difficult to find another as well paying. Like many in the Depression, Dan was forced to seek sporadic station work to make ends meet. They also rented out the rooms in their Burrellaba family home to get some extra money. Early in 1929, Dan managed to land a job droving cattle. He took with him one of his tenants and a good mate, John Cook. The two spent the next couple of years engaged in prospecting and random station jobs, O'Keefe becoming somewhat of a mentor, teaching Cook how to read, write and count, as his poor education limited him from doing so. In June of 1931, O'Keefe and Cook were working on Glendore Station, Dan tasked with bringing a mob of cattle up from Dalby. When he got to Camboon, he heard from the local postmaster, James Sinclair, about the newly established Cracow goldfield. As Dan was short of money, he raced back to Glendore to borrow £3 from Cook to pay for the claim. He then set out with 2 co-workers, Alfred Jarvis and a fellow war veteran, Christmas Jim Mills. Another man who had heard of the burgeoning goldfield was Alan Anderson, who came up from Sydney to peg a claim beside his brother Cecil. Most of the best claims had already been taken up, but Alan was lucky enough to find an empty section of land beside his brother's mine. However, the tiresome day was growing dark, so Alan insisted on claiming that spot the following morning after the night's rest. The next morning, Alan was bewildered to find that 3 men had turned up in the night and claimed the spot that he wanted. The main claim over jovially introduced himself as Danny O'Keefe. When asked what he was going to call the claim, he responded with, "The Sunrise." O'Keefe, Cook, Mills and Jarvis took turns working the mine in shifts. They all had their titles. Dan was the discoverer, Cook the initial funder, Mills was the money man, and Jarvis was a poor struggler, so we gave him a chance. The Sunrise proved to be a worthy investment. The average crushing yielded 1 ounce and 6 pennyweights of gold for every tonne of rock. In December of 1931, the Maryborough Chronicle declared the Sunrise is now locally considered the richest claim at Cracow. Dan O'Keefe became one of several unofficial mayors of Cracow, calling for an official Cracow-Theodore-Eidsvold connection road, regularly attending council and commerce meetings, along with seeking representation from the Postmaster General's Department on the matter. Speaking to the press in early 1932, O'Keefe said, "Cracow is a rich, stable field with a great future. There can be no doubt that it's a permanent field." By 1932, most of Cracow's big claims had been taken on by companies and were now worked as major mines. After some negotiation, the Sunrise claim sold out to the Golden Plateau for a little over £15,000 cash and 10,000 shares, equally divided between O'Keefe, Mills, Jarvis and Cook. With their newly acquired fortunes, they went their separate ways. Cook bought property in Rockhampton, Mills worked in the mines, married and eventually settled down in Cracow. Jarvis acquired various building contracts throughout Cracow, from the Regent Theatre and Cafe to the hotel and hospital. Not bad for some poor struggler. Dan O'Keefe went back home to Barella. 9 months later, the O'Keefe family bought and took over the Anchor Hotel in Rockhampton. Even whilst in high places, Dan never forgot about Cracow, still regularly attending council and commerce meetings, raising issues on Cracow residents' behalf. In an interview where he stated he and his wife's intentions for the hotel, he stated he'll give free board to any Cracow digger when they're in the big scrap. 5 years later, they purchased the Riviera Hotel in Emu Park. Along with these accolades, Dan is noted as attending every RSL event in Rockhampton whilst there, wearing a badge which read, D. O'Keefe, representing Cracow's sub-branch. In his older age, he was the president of the Anchor Rangers Soccer Club and a die-hard supporter of the Rocky Norths footy team. Summarising himself to a journalist, Dan exclaimed, "I am a soldier and old battler for the labour movement. I've been mining and prospecting in Queensland for nearly 40 years and have struck it rich at last." Daniel O'Keefe passed away in his Rockhampton home on Brown Street on August 19, 1949, at the age of 75. The Sunrise deposit which O'Keefe founded made up a bulk of the Golden Plateau's output and was worked continuously by major mining companies until 1994. It was the decisions and sacrifices made by men like Daniel O'Keefe who not only served their country, but served to shape the towns within it and directly contributed to the economy and wider Australian psyche for centuries to come.